Your menu is too traditional for where we want to take this restaurant. That's what Vanessa told me. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and she'd summoned me to her office, an office she'd occupied for all of 3 weeks as the new owner of what was once Brierloft Beastro here in Providence, Rhode Island. 3 weeks, and she already had fixed opinions about the food I'd been lovingly crafting for 7 years. I'm Luca Moretti, 43 years old, and I was the executive chef who had poured his soul into building Brierloft from a quiet neighborhood joint into one of the most respected dining destinations on the East Coast. I didn't do it with culinary fireworks or trendy gastronomy. I did it with food that tasted real, food that stirred memories. We need a fresh culinary identity, she continued, barely glancing up from her sleek laptop. Something more Instagram-worthy, more fusion, more excitement. I didn't argue. There was no point. I just nodded once and asked her when my last day would be. She seemed taken aback by that, by how readily I accepted my fate. Maybe she expected me to plead, to negotiate. But I don't beg people to understand what they're clearly incapable of seeing. If you've ever poured your heart into something only to see it dismissed, then maybe this story will speak to you. Stay with us at Life Stories 1, and please subscribe to hear what happened next. 7 years. For 7 years, I'd poured my soul into every plate that left my kitchen. 7 years spent perfecting recipes my grandmother, Nonna Amelia, had taught me in our tiny kitchen in Naples, when I was barely tall enough to see over the countertop. 7 years meticulously building a menu that made people close their eyes in contentment with the very first bite. Vanessa just offered a relieved little smile. 2 weeks should be sufficient for the transition, she said briskly. And you'll need to provide detailed recipes for all your signature dishes, of course. Of course, I echoed, nodding again, though we both knew, or at least I knew, that I'd never truly written down a single one of those recipes. Not the real ones, not the way I actually conjured them, with the feel, the smell, the instinct that came from a lifetime of love for honest food. That evening, during the dinner service, I watched my kitchen staff move with the seamless grace of a well-rehearsed orchestra. Jason, my grill master, working with the precision of a metronome. Ellie, my pastry chef, plating her desserts with the delicate touch of a surgeon. They didn't know yet. None of them knew that the heart was about to be unceremoniously ripped out of this place. After closing, long after the last customer had left, and the lights were dimmed, I sat alone at the worn oak bar with a glass of good bourbon. The dining room was shrouded in darkness, except for the single small spotlight above me. I ran my fingers over the smooth, familiar surface of the bar top, a place where I'd served thousands of customers, many of whom had become friends over shared meals and stories. My grandfather, Nonno Antonio, had opened the first Moretti's in Naples when he was just 22. I grew up in the warm embrace of that kitchen, watching him create magic with seemingly nothing more than flour, eggs, and whatever vegetables looked freshest at the market that morning. Food wasn't fancy in our family. It was honest. It was memory. It was the sacred ritual that made people pause their hectic lives, gather around a table, and remember what truly mattered. I hadn't actually come to Providence with dreams of becoming a chef. I was studying architecture at the Rhode Island School of Design, washing dishes at night in a local eatery to pay my tuition. Then, one frantic evening, the line cook called in sick. The owner was desperate. I stepped in. Something just clicked that night. The intense heat, the controlled chaos, the rhythm of the kitchen. It felt more right, more me, than any drafting table ever had. 6 months later, I dropped out of RISD. My father didn't speak to me for a full year. I worked my way up through 4 different kitchens, learning, absorbing, honing my craft, before finally landing at Brierloft Beastro. Back then, it was just a struggling neighborhood spot with faded decor and a menu no one could remember 5 minutes after leaving. The owner, Harold, a kind man with tired eyes, was on the verge of closing the doors for good when he decided to take one last gamble. He gave me full control of the kitchen. "Make food that matters to you, Luca," he'd said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I'm all out of ideas." So I did. I built a menu around the dishes my grandmother had made, the flavors of my childhood. The braised lamb that simmered for 6 hours with rosemary and juniper berries, the rich seafood stew alive with saffron, and the tang of the sea, a recipe my grandfather had learned from his mother. The impossibly moist olive oil cake, soaked in orange liqueur, the centerpiece of every Moretti family wedding. People noticed. First the locals, then the food critics, then the tourists who'd read the glowing reviews online. We weren't trendy. We were something deeper, something that lasted. We were necessary. Harold eventually sold the place when his wife got sick. He needed the money for her treatments. I understood. The new owners were a small restaurant group who, thankfully, mostly left me alone. "Don't fix what isn't broken, chef," their CEO told me during our first meeting. For 3 good years, it worked. Then, they sold to Vanessa. And Vanguard Hospitality. She started showing up during prep, fluttering around the kitchen, asking questions that made it painfully clear she didn't understand restaurants, or food, or the soul that goes into either. She'd bring her friends in during the busiest part of dinner service, sending back dishes not because they weren't delicious, but because they weren't pretty enough for their social media feeds. 2 weeks before she officially fired me, I overheard her on the phone in her office, the door slightly ajar. "We'll keep the Brierloft name for now," she was saying, her voice dripping with corporate confidence. "But everything else changes. New concept, new chef, new energy." I should have prepared myself then, should have seen the writing on the wall. But some naive part of me, the part that still believed in the power of good food and honest work, couldn't fathom that anyone would willingly dismantle something that worked so beautifully, something people genuinely loved. The night before my last official day, I made all our signature dishes one final time. I tasted each one carefully, savoring every nuance, committing the exact balance of flavors to memory. Not that I truly needed to. These dishes weren't just recipes. They were in my blood, part of my very being. My last night at Brierloft Beastro was quiet, almost somber. I didn't make a speech to the staff, didn't want a farewell party. I just cooked the service like any other night, though my hands felt unusually heavy with each dish I sent out, each plate a small goodbye. After closing, I left my keys on Vanessa's gleaming, empty desk, along with a neatly typed list of recipes, the official, sterile ones we kept for health inspections, and for the line cooks to follow by rote. Not my recipes. Not really. I drove home to my small apartment overlooking the city, opened a bottle of Barolo I'd been saving for a special occasion that now felt like a wake, and sat on my little balcony, looking out at the indifferent city lights. I felt nothing. No anger, no profound sadness, just a hollow, echoing space where 7 years of relentless work and quiet passion used to live. The next morning, my phone started buzzing with texts from my former kitchen staff. Vanessa, true to her word, had brought in a new executive chef, some guy named Kevin, apparently well-regarded from a trendy flavor-of-the-month spot in Boston. He was already in the Brierloft kitchen, they said, rearranging stations, talking loudly about elevating the menu and deconstructing the classics. I didn't respond. I just turned off my phone and went for a long walk downtown, trying to clear my head. 3 days passed in a blur of aimless wandering and too much coffee before Thomas, my loyal sous chef for the past 5 years, showed up at my apartment door. He was still wearing his kitchen whites, though they were rumpled and stained, and his eyes were wild with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "Chef, it's a disaster," he said, pushing past me into my small living room without waiting for an invitation. "Kevin, he can't replicate anything. He's trying, he really is. But the dishes, they're coming out all wrong. Customers are complaining. It's chaos." "They have the recipes," I said quietly, though I knew what his answer would be. Thomas shot me a look that spoke volumes. "Chef, they have what you wrote down. They don't have what you did. They don't have the feel, the timing, the soul you put into it." I just shrugged, offering him a glass of water, which he gratefully accepted. New chef, new restaurant, I said, trying to sound detached. That's how it works, Thomas. But the regulars are noticing, Chef. Mrs. Carpenter sent back the lamb twice last night. Said it wasn't right. Wasn't your lamb. Mrs. Carpenter. She'd been coming in every Thursday evening for 5 years straight, always ordering the braised lamb. She always told me, her eyes misting over, how it reminded her of the magical year she'd spent in southern Italy, just before her husband passed away. For her, that dish wasn't just food. It was a memory, a connection to a cherished past. They're doing a big relaunch next week, Thomas continued, pacing my small apartment. Food critics, influencers, the whole 9 yards. Vanessa's calling it Brierloft Evolved. He said the name with a sneer. As he spoke, something shifted inside my chest. Not satisfaction, not yet. But a flicker of recognition, perhaps. The beginning of an answer to a question I hadn't even fully allowed myself to form yet. A question about what comes next when the thing you've poured your life into is taken away. Are you looking for work, Thomas? I asked, the words surprising even myself. Thomas blinked, stopping his pacing. What? Chef, I don't know. Why? I thought of my grandfather's old place downtown, the building he'd poured his own life into. It was empty now, a silent monument to his legacy, sitting there since he passed away. I still owned it. An idea, vague and unformed a moment ago, began to solidify. You thinking about opening your own spot, Chef? Thomas asked, his eyes suddenly bright with a new kind of hope. I hadn't been, not consciously, not until that very second, but saying it out loud, even just considering it, made something click into place with surprising clarity. I'd given 7 years of my life to someone else's dream. Maybe it was finally time to build my own. Maybe, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. Maybe I am. Are you interested? Thomas didn't hesitate for a second. Hell yes, Chef, and I bet Ellie and Jason would come too. They're miserable over there. That night, for the first time in weeks, sleep eluded me for a different reason. Not emptiness, but a burgeoning excitement. I pulled out my grandfather years old, grease-stained notebook, the one filled with his half-written recipe ideas, his scribbled notes about suppliers, his observations about customers. His handwriting was shaky in the later years. The ink faded, but his culinary thinking, his philosophy of food, was always crystal clear. On the inside cover, in his elegant old-world script, he'd written, "The food remembers, even when people forget." I ran my finger over those words, feeling a profound connection to him, to the generations of Morettis who had found their purpose in feeding others. And in that moment, something stirred deep within me. Not anger at Vanessa, not even a desire for revenge. Something cleaner, simpler. The pure, undeniable need to make food that mattered again. Food that was mine. The week after I left Brierloft Beastro, the first wave of online food blogger posts started to appear. They were, as expected, focused on the new Brierloft Evolved. Pictures flooded Instagram, deconstructed, almost unrecognizable versions of my signature dishes. Foams where there should have been rich, savory sauces. Tiny, artfully arranged portions that looked more like abstract paintings than actual food. The comment sections beneath these posts quickly filled with confused and disappointed regulars. "What happened to the real menu?" one lamented. "This isn't what made Brierloft special," another wrote. "Where's Chef Luca's lamb?" I was in the middle of applying a fresh coat of paint to the faded walls of my grandfather's old restaurant space when my phone rang. It was Vanessa, the first time I'd heard from her since I'd walked out of Brierloft. "Luca," she said, her voice a carefully constructed blend of honey and steel. "How are you?" "Fine, Vanessa," I replied, setting down my paint roller. "We seem to be having some, transition challenges here," she continued, the sweetness in her voice becoming a little more strained. "I was hoping you might be available for a consultation, just for a few days. to help smooth things over with Kevin and the team. I pictured Kevin, the trendy Boston chef, struggling in my old kitchen, trying to decipher the soulless recipes I'd left behind. "What kind of challenges, Vanessa?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She paused, a telltale sign of her discomfort. "Well, some of the signature dishes, they aren't coming out quite right. Kevin is very talented, of course, but customers are noticing differences, significant differences." "You have the recipes," I said, repeating the same flat statement I'd made to Thomas. Yes, we have the recipes," she said, a note of impatience creeping in. "But there seem to be nuances missing, little things that make a big difference." I almost laughed out loud. Nuances. Nuances like how I meticulously adjusted the seasoning for the braised lamb based on the time of year and the age of the animal. Nuances like how the seafood stew needed a touch more acidity when we were using Gulf shrimp instead of the delicate local catch. Nuances like how the olive oil cake required a slightly different baking time and temperature on humid Providence days. These weren't little things, they were the soul of the dishes. "I could compensate you very well, Luca," Vanessa pressed on, sensing my hesitation. "And of course, we would credit you as a consulting chef on the new menu. It would be a good opportunity for you." "I'm busy, Vanessa," I said simply. Too busy trying to scrub decades of grime off my grandfather's beautiful terracotta floor tiles. "Look, Luca." Her voice suddenly hardened, the honey evaporating completely. "The relaunch is in 3 days. We have critics from New York and Boston coming. We have investors flying in. I need those dishes to be right." "Then perhaps," I said, my own voice hardening just a fraction, "you shouldn't have fired the person who created them." There was a sharp, brittle silence on the other end of the line. Then, "I'll double your last salary," she said, her voice tight. "Just for 2 weeks of intensive consultation. No, triple it. Name your price." "It's not about the money, Vanessa," I told her, and for the first time in our conversation, I felt a flicker of something other than weary detachment. Maybe it was a spark of my old Moretti fire. "Then what is it about?" she snapped, her carefully cultivated composure finally cracking. "Some kind of wounded pride?" "I made a business decision, Luca, and now I'm making another one to rectify a temporary setback. Good luck with your relaunch, Vanessa," I said, and before she could reply, I hung up the phone and went back to painting, the rhythmic motion of the roller strangely soothing. An hour later, Thomas called. His voice was a conspiratorial whisper. "Chef, you won't believe this. Vanessa is in the Brierloft kitchen right now. She's watching Kevin, and the line cooks prepare your dishes, taking copious notes, asking incredibly detailed questions about every single step, every ingredient. She's trying to reverse engineer your magic." 2 days before the highly anticipated relaunch, I was at the farmer's market, a Saturday morning ritual I hadn't abandoned, carefully selecting tomatoes, when Harold, the original owner of Brierloft, found me. He looked older, frailer than I remembered, but his eyes were still kind. "Heard what happened, Luca," he said, stepping beside me at the stall. "Also heard you're thinking of opening your own place." News, especially bad news, traveled with lightning speed in the tight-knit Providence restaurant world. "Thinking about it, Harold," I admitted. "Vanessa called me yesterday," he continued, picking up a ripe heirloom tomato and weighing it gently in his hand. "Asked if I had any of your old notes or records about your cooking from when you first started at Brierloft. Sounded desperate." I raised an eyebrow. "And what did you tell her, Harold?" He gave me a wry smile. "I told her your food was always magic to me, Luca, and I never knew how you did it, which is the God's honest truth." He paused, his smile fading. "She's in trouble, son. You know those investors she brought in? They're expecting the same Brierloft they've been reading about for years. The one you built." That afternoon, Ellie, my former pastry chef, sent me a text message. "They're trying to reverse engineer your olive oil cake. Currently on attempt number 5. Still not right. Kevin looks like he's about to cry." I smiled, a genuine, almost mischievous smile despite myself. That damn cake had taken me 2 years of obsessive tinkering to perfect. The night before the Brierloft Evolved relaunch, the grand unveiling of Vanessa's new vision, she showed up unannounced at my apartment. I was so surprised to see her standing in my modest hallway that I let her in, a decision I almost instantly regretted. "One last offer, Luca," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, her expensive trench coat still buttoned, her designer handbag clutched like a shield. "Come back! Full creative control. 20% ownership stake in the restaurant." I leaned against my small kitchen counter, folding my arms. The offer was tempting. I couldn't deny it. 20% of a restaurant like Brierloft, even a struggling Brierloft, was significant. For a fleeting moment, I considered it. The security, the prestige. "Why, Vanessa?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. "Why now?" "Because the practice run-through for the critics tonight was an unmitigated disaster," she admitted, her voice raw, the usual corporate polish stripped away. "Because our reservation book for the next month, the one that's supposedly filled with eager diners, is built entirely on your reputation, not Kevin's. Because I made a miscalculation, Luca. A very expensive miscalculation." I thought about her offer. I thought about the long hours, the endless pressure, the feeling of always having to prove myself. Then I thought about my grandfather's empty restaurant downtown, the quiet promise of its silent rooms, the idea of cooking on my own terms, answering to no one but the food itself. "I appreciate the offer, Vanessa," I said finally, my voice firm. "But I've already started something new, something of my own." Her face hardened, the brief flicker of vulnerability extinguished. "If you're planning on opening a competing restaurant, Luca, you should know that your contract with Brierloft had a rather stringent non-compete clause. You can't open any establishment with a similar concept within a 5-mile radius for 2 years after your departure." I hadn't remembered that. In the turmoil of being fired, of trying to figure out my next move, I hadn't thought to check the fine print of a contract I'd signed 7 years ago. A cold knot formed in my stomach. My grandfather's place, the heart of my new dream, was only 2 miles from Brierloft. "Good to know, Vanessa," I said, my mind reeling, as I opened my apartment door for her to leave. "Good luck with your relaunch tomorrow." After she left, the silence in my apartment felt suffocating. I immediately called my cousin Anthony, who practiced business law in the city. The non-compete, he confirmed after I emailed him a copy of my old contract, was real and, on the surface, potentially enforceable. I'd hit a wall I hadn't even seen coming, a wall that threatened to crush my nascent dream before it had even taken its first breath. That night, sleep was impossible. I paced my small apartment, reviewing my options. Delay the opening of my new place? Find a different location, further away? Abandoning my grandfather's building? Fight the non-compete in court? A costly and uncertain battle I could ill afford? None of these options felt right. At 3 a.m, unable to bear the confines of my apartment any longer, I drove to my grandfather's old building. I sat in the dark, half-renovated space, surrounded by the ghosts of his culinary past and the uncertain shadows of my own future. Thinking, wrestling with the problem. The next morning, relaunch day at Brierloft Evolved, I met with Anthony at his downtown office. He'd been reviewing the contract again, his brow furrowed in concentration. "There might be a loophole, Luca," he said finally, looking up from the document. "A small one, but it might be enough." He tapped a clause on the page. "The non-compete specifies you can't open a similar restaurant concept with competing cuisine within the 5-mile radius." "And how do we define similar concept?" I asked, a glimmer of hope igniting. "Well," Anthony said, a thoughtful expression on his face, "your grandfather's place, Moretti's, was a traditional, old-school Italian restaurant, right? Red sauce, pasta, classic dishes. Not the kind of new American cuisine you were doing at Brierloft." I considered this. My menu at Brierloft had certainly drawn heavily on my Italian heritage, on my grandmother's cooking. But it had evolved, incorporated local New England ingredients, refined techniques. It wasn't strictly traditional. I'd been planning something similar for my new place, my dishes, my style, but not slavishly bound by tradition. What if I went completely old school? I said slowly, an idea taking shape. My grandfather's exact recipes from his Naples restaurant, red checkered tablecloths, Chianti bottles with candles dripping wax, the whole classic trattoria vibe. Anthony nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. A completely different concept, Luca. Different enough, I think, that we could successfully argue it doesn't directly compete with whatever fusion or Instagram-worthy cuisine Vanessa is trying to push at Brierloft now. It's risky, but it's possible. We'd be targeting a different diner. I thanked him, my mind racing. I'd been so focused on recreating, in some ways, what I'd built and lost at Brierloft, that I hadn't seriously considered going back to my deepest roots, to the foundational food that had started everything for my family. On my way home from Anthony's office, I got a text message from Jason, who, against his better judgment, was still working the line at Brierloft for the relaunch service. Critics are here. Food's not right. Kevin's panicking. Vanessa looks like she's seen a ghost. I didn't respond. It wasn't my problem anymore. I had a new, older path to forge. That evening, Thomas, Ellie, and Jason came over to my apartment after their grueling shift at the Brierloft Evolved relaunch. Their faces were grim, etched with exhaustion and disbelief. "Chef, it was a bloodbath," Thomas said, sinking onto my old sofa and gratefully accepting the beer I offered. None of the signature dishes worked. Not a single one. The lamb was tough. The seafood stew was bland. And Ellie's? Well, your olive oil cake. It was as dense as a brick. Vanessa kept making excuses, Ellie added, shaking her head, blaming the ingredient suppliers, the kitchen equipment, the humidity, everything but the obvious. Which is? I asked, though I already knew the answer. That they don't have you, chef, Jason said simply, his loyalty a small comfort in the midst of the chaos. We talked late into the night, dissecting what had happened. How Kevin, despite his trendy Boston credentials, had tried to follow my written recipes, but had utterly missed all the unwritten steps, the intuition, the years of ingrained knowledge that couldn't be quantified on a page. How the critics had been visibly, sometimes audibly, disappointed. How Vanessa had apparently disappeared into her office halfway through the disastrous service, leaving her new chef to face the music alone. "There's more," Thomas said, lowering his voice even though we were alone in my apartment. I overheard Vanessa on the phone with someone, an investor, I think, practically in tears. Turns out she leveraged everything, her company, Vanguard Hospitality, everything, to buy Brierloft. She was expecting to optimize it, as she put it, and then flip it for a quick, massive profit. Based on its reputation, I said, understanding dawning. Exactly, Thomas nodded. A reputation which was built entirely on your food, chef. She's in serious trouble, Ellie said, her expression a mixture of pity and something else, something closer to schadenfreude. Without good reviews from this relaunch, without the buzz she was counting on, she might lose her financial backing. I should have felt a surge of satisfaction, a sense of vindication. Instead, I just felt a strange, almost detached clarity. This whole debacle had never really been about my cooking, not for Vanessa. It had been about money, about ambition, about using what I had painstakingly built as a stepping stone for her own profit. "I'm opening my grandfather's place," I announced to them, the decision now firm in my heart. Going back to traditional Italian, his recipes, his way, simple, honest, soulful. "What about the non-compete clause?" Thomas asked, his brow furrowed with concern. I explained Anthony's thinking, the potential loophole of a distinctly different restaurant concept. Different concept, different target audience, I said. And honestly, if she wants to fight me on it after the reviews from tonight come out, let her try. I suspect her restaurant is about to have much bigger problems than me. The next morning, the first online reviews of Brierloft Evolved appeared. They were as brutal, as scathingly accurate as we had expected. A pale imitation of its former self. All style, no substance. The soul of Brierloft has vanished, replaced by an expensive, soulless void. That very afternoon, I signed a lease on a small, unassuming storefront directly across the street from my grandfather's larger, still under renovation building. A place for a simple cafe, a place where I could cook and generate some income while the main restaurant was being brought back to life. I named it Moretti's Table. No grand concept, no gimmicks, just food that mattered. On a hunch, I drove past Brierloft Beastro that night. The usually bustling parking lot was half empty. A hastily printed paper sign was taped to the front door. Limited menu tonight. The unraveling had well and truly begun. 3 weeks later, Moretti's Table was ready to open its doors. It was nothing fancy, just 12 tables, freshly painted white walls, and my grandfather's old, lovingly polished copper pots hanging in the small, open kitchen. I'd handwritten the menu myself on simple cardstock. 5 appetizers, 5 entrees, 3 desserts. All his recipes, unchanged since he'd perfected them decades ago in Naples. I'd been meticulous about permits, licenses, every legal detail. Anthony had reviewed all the paperwork to ensure we were as protected as possible if Vanessa decided to make trouble. But so far, she'd been conspicuously silent. According to Thomas, who had gratefully quit Brierloft along with Ellie and Jason the day after the disastrous relaunch, Vanessa was too busy trying to salvage her rapidly sinking investment to worry about me. The night before our quiet opening, my father called. We hadn't spoken much, not really spoken, since I'd abandoned architecture school 15 years prior. "Your mother told me about the new place," he said, his voice sounding older, softer than I remembered. "Opening tomorrow, using Nonno Antonio's recipes," she said. "Every one of them, Papa," I confirmed. "Just like he made them." There was a long pause on the line. Then, "He'd be proud, Luca. More proud than he would have been of another architect in the family." Something tightened in my chest, an old ache easing. "You should come sometime, Papa." "Maybe I will," he said. And then, "Luca, I still have his old recipe book, the real one, with all his handwritten notes, his secrets. Your mother thought you might want it." I hadn't known such a book existed. My grandfather had always cooked from memory, from feel. "Papa," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "I would like that very much." 2 days after we opened Moretti's Table, with no advertising beyond a single Instagram post by Ellie, we had a line out the door and down the block. Word had spread like wildfire among the loyal Brierloft regulars that Luca Moretti was cooking again. We served 40 covers that first night, just the 4 of us. Me and Thomas in the tiny kitchen, Ellie and Jason working miracles in the front of the house. Every dish that went out was exactly as my grandfather would have made it. Simple, perfect, honest. A week later, Mrs. Carpenter, the Thursday lamb regular from Brierloft, found us. She hugged me with tears in her eyes. "Luca, I've been looking everywhere for you," she whispered. "Nothing's been right since you left." That night, I added my grandfather's classic braised lamb to the menu, just for her. 2 weeks in, we were booked solid every single night. I'd already hired 2 more kitchen staff and another server just to keep up. My father had sent the recipe book, a tattered, leather-bound journal, its pages filled with my grandfather's spidery script, his culinary secrets, things I'd never known about his cooking, about where he'd learned his craft, about what each beloved dish truly meant to him. It felt like he was right there in the kitchen with me, guiding my hands. On our 1-month anniversary, a busy Friday night, I arrived early to find a crisp manila envelope taped to the front door of Moretti's Table. Inside was a formal, intimidating letter from Vanessa's lawyers, alleging violation of the non-compete agreement and threatening swift legal action. I handed it to Anthony over coffee later that afternoon. "Right on schedule," he said with a wry smile, barely glancing at the document. "I was wondering when this would finally show up." "Can they shut us down, Anthony?" I asked, the old anxiety returning. He set down the letter. "They can try, Luca, but I've been building our defense since the day we first talked about this. I have documented evidence, sworn affidavits from former Brierloft patrons, even statements from food suppliers, all confirming that Moretti's Table is a traditional Italian restaurant based entirely on your family's historical recipes. It is a completely different culinary concept from the new American fusion Brierloft was known for under your tenure. He paused, taking a sip of his espresso. Different target audience, different price point, different style, different everything. So, are we good? Better than good, Luca. Their argument for a similar concept is extremely weak, especially now that Brierloft itself, in a desperate attempt to rebrand after the relaunch disaster, has changed its menu completely. This was news to me. They did? Anthony nodded. Went full molecular gastronomy last week, apparently. Foams, gels, edible soil, the whole 9 yards, trying to chase the latest fleeting trend. They've essentially admitted through their own actions that they are no longer the same restaurant you worked at, nor are they anything close to what you're doing now. I smiled, a slow, genuine smile. Perfect timing. That evening, as I was prepping for service, a food critic from the Providence Journal walked into Moretti's Table. It was the same critic who'd written the scathing review of Brierloft's relaunch disaster. He didn't know I recognized him. I just cooked. I sent out food that would have made my grandfather weep with pride. The next morning, his review appeared online. The headline read, "The heart of Brierloft didn't vanish. It just moved across town and found its true home." By noon that day, our reservation list was full for the next 3 months. 6 months after opening Moretti's Table, I received a call from Harold, the original owner of Brierloft. "Luca, have you seen it?" he asked without preamble, his voice tinged with a strange mixture of sadness and vindication. "Seen what, Harold?" "Brierloft. It's for sale. Vanessa's cutting her losses, trying to get out before she loses her shirt completely." I hadn't known. I hadn't really thought about Brierloft or Vanessa in months. I'd been too busy running my own place, expanding the menu with more of my grandfather's treasures, training new staff, living and breathing the honest work of feeding people well. "Asking price is half what she paid for it," Harold continued. "She's desperate for a quick sale, any sale." "Not my problem, Harold," I said, though something stirred within me. Not quite satisfaction, but a quiet sense of things coming full circle, of a natural order reasserting itself. That afternoon, Anthony called. "Good news, Luca. Vanessa's officially dropping the lawsuit. Seems she has bigger problems to deal with, like selling a spectacularly failing restaurant before her investors take her to the cleaners." "Exactly," I said. "Want to know the best part?" Anthony chuckled. "Her investors are suing her for misrepresentation, claiming she sold them on the reputation of a restaurant, your Brierloft, that effectively ceased to exist the moment she fired you and tried to reinvent it in her own image." I thought about that as I prepped for dinner service that evening, the comforting rhythm of chopping vegetables, the familiar scent of simmering sauces. I thought about the shortcuts Vanessa had tried to take, about how she'd only ever seen the glittering surface of what made Brierloft special, never understanding the deep, nourishing foundation it was built upon. 3 days later, a sleek black town car pulled up outside Moretti's Table during the bustling lunch service. Vanessa stepped out, straightened her impeccably tailored jacket, and walked inside. The lively chatter in the dining room seemed to dim as regulars recognized her. I watched from the kitchen pass as she scanned the packed restaurant, her gaze taking in the simple, unpretentious decor, the happy, animated diners, the small staff moving with practiced, easy precision. Then she saw me. Our eyes met across the room. I expected to see anger in her face, or perhaps resentment, even bitterness. Instead, I saw something that looked almost like resignation, maybe even a grudging respect. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, then turned on her heel and walked out. I never saw her again. The following week, Brierloft Beastro closed its doors for good. The building remained empty for months, a quiet, forlorn monument to ambition without understanding, to style without soul. I didn't celebrate its demise. I didn't need to. The food, my grandfather's food, had spoken for itself, quietly and truthfully. 1 year after opening Moretti's table, we expanded into my grandfather's original building next door. The painstaking renovation was finally complete. His old copper pots, polished to a gleaming sheen, still hung in the new, much larger kitchen. We kept the cafe as a beloved neighborhood lunch spot and opened the main restaurant, Moretti's, for dinner service. On our grand opening night, I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching the dining room fill with a vibrant mix of old and new faces, families, couples celebrating anniversaries, regulars who'd followed me faithfully from Brierloft, and curious newcomers drawn by the growing word of mouth. Thomas, now my trusted chef de cuisine, nudged my shoulder. "You going to stand there all night like a statue, chef, or are we going to cook some food?" I smiled, a deep, contented smile, and returned to the line, ready to work. Halfway through a very busy service, Ellie appeared at my side in the kitchen, a rare, excited flush on her cheeks. "Chef, there's someone here to see you. He says he's your father." In the dining room, at a quiet corner table, sat my father. He stood when he saw me approach, extending his hand formally, a gesture from a lifetime of polite distance. I ignored it and hugged him instead, a real hug, one that spoke of years of unspoken things. "The place looks good, Luca," he said, his eyes, so like my grandfather's, glancing around the warm, inviting room, just like Nonno Antonio would have had it. "With a few modern updates, Papa," I admitted, "but the heart, the soul of it, that's all him." We talked through his entire meal, the first real, unguarded conversation we'd had in years, about my grandfather, about food, about what it truly meant to build something that lasted, something with integrity. As he was leaving, his hand brushed mine, and he pressed something small and cool into my palm. A key. "To the old vineyard in Campania, Luca," he explained, his voice softer now. "Nonno Antonio left it to me in his will, but it should be yours. You understand the land, the flavors, the way he did. Maybe someday you'll make wine there as good as your food." That night, long after the last guest had departed and the kitchen was scrubbed clean, I sat alone at the small bar in Moretti's, a glass of my grandfather's favorite Amarone in my hand. The dining room was dark, hushed, except for the single, gentle light above me. On the wall, framed simply, hung a copy of that Providence Journal review, the one that had validated everything. The heart of Brierloft didn't vanish, it just moved across town and found its true home. I'd never set out to destroy what Vanessa had tried to build, or to seek revenge for a dismissal that had, in retrospect, been a gift. I'd only ever wanted to create something authentic, something true. In the end, that quiet, persistent dedication had been more than enough. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's simply doing what you were meant to do, with passion and integrity, and doing it exceptionally well. I raised my glass in a silent toast, to my grandfather's enduring memory, to the empty chairs that would fill again with laughter and life tomorrow, and to the winding, unexpected journey that had finally brought me home. This place, Moretti's, wasn't just a restaurant. It was a legacy. It was family. It was home. Thank you for joining Luca on his culinary journey back to his roots. If this story of passion, perseverance, and the true meaning of success resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please consider subscribing to Life Stories and clicking the notification bell so you don't miss our next inspiring tale. Your support means the world to us.